An identity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And identities are fragile, but sometimes they're close to breaking, and sometimes they're more resilient. Now, for an identity to break, it means that there are parts within us that run counter, meaning we are a composition of different parts, different identities that we've developed over time. And one of the more difficult aspects of being an individual in a traumatic culture is that we've all been exposed to trauma, and traumatic memories tend to be the most intense, the most crystallized memories of our life, resulting in a fear of traumatic reenactment. And so, that's one identity available. PTSD is an extreme example where you relive and reenact the traumatic memory in your body, in your heart, and your mind on a regular basis. Childhood traumas are amongst the most difficult because every child makes up a story about how they are personally at fault for the cruelty that is directed towards them from the giants that they depend on. So if as a 6-year-old boy, you are beaten, humiliated, and then when you ask for help are further beaten, and then banished so that your crying does not disturb those that beat you, the story that you make up about such an experience would be one of worthlessness. I don't deserve, I'm worthless, I'm not safe, God doesn't love me, etc., etc. And that in a highly emotional state, meaning a state of intense emotion, fear, pain, loneliness, those thoughts are seared in, sometimes as very fundamental choices. Well, as we grow up and learn a little bit, we say, I can't have been that bad. Our parents were sociopathic. The world is relatively dysfunctional. And we start to shape a different pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. But that new pattern is not as crystallized. It's not as intensely seared into the neuronal pathways as the traumatic identity. And what that means is that when something in our life shocks us, disorients us, and our ego, our I, desperately grasps the ego's greatest fear, the fear of the unknown, not knowing what it is, dying, etc. The ego always grasps for something solid, something it can depend on. And so when our present patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being are disrupted by a new trauma, a new shock, we often regress and revert, and what we'll grasp for is whatever is most familiar, most of the family. And that can often be a traumatic identity, a traumatic memory. And if that isn't, in fact, what's most solid, then we will hold on to that, right? And there's some part of us that does not want to let go of that, because to do so is to face the unknown, to face the uncertainty. One of the things that can be said for traumatic memories is that they're always there for us, right? That they never leave us. And it's both tragic and informative of the hierarchy of ego values, that the ego would rather hang on desperately to something that it knows, that is the worst possible memory of its life, than to face the risk of non-being, just being in total chaos, in total helplessness, in total uncertainty, right? And the other thing about traumatic memories is they are the survivor of pre-traumatic memories, meaning, let's say we were driving happily along, looking out the window, etc., and we hit a telephone pole. Well, as soon as we hit the telephone pole, the pre-trauma memory is obliterated. Our body posture is ripped apart as we fly out the window. Our thoughts are instantly transported to, what will happen if I die, and this. Our feelings are, completely disoriented. And so the old identity, the old pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being is shattered, and its fragility is revealed. Now, the new traumatic experience, on the other hand, is incredibly intense, and in its intensity, it's very concrete, it's very real. And so it's something the ego can hang on to. I'm not going to just dissolve into nothingness, etc. I'm now here in this moment, right? And PTSD is the phenomena of reliving and reliving. And identity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And to be a pattern, you have to repeat it, right? You have to remember the pattern, remember the pattern, repeat the pattern again and again. That's what makes it an identity, a pattern. And so it's interesting that the I, the ego, in moments of chaos, uncertainty, etc., reaches for something that it knows, and that the intense traumatic memories often rise to the surface. They're most available to grasp. But within the panoply of identities, right? So then we have one, for example, childhood traumatic identity of being completely unlovable, completely unaccepted, unworthy of love, mysteriously doing something wrong. And then we have other, more passive, less intense memories of, that seeming a bit irrational and deciding, no, that we are worth living, at least seems to be, right? And when we have a traumatic memory, the balance between those two identities, those two patterns, I'm lovable, I'm worth living, I'm completely unlovable, I'm not worth living, there are different patterns, right? And in a chaotic moment, in a fragile moment, where our current cultivated pattern is hanging by a thread, right? If it snaps, we're going to regress to something that the ego is more comfortable. You have, for example, the dynamic of someone raised in an abusive home, feeling unworthy, they're never going to amount to anything, all of this, and then somebody loves them. And it's such an exciting new identity. It's a new pattern, right? I am worthy. I am being loved. I'm amounting to something. I'm special to someone. It's just this huge upshift in identity and pattern. There's all this stuff, but then, right? Then you have a fight, and they leave, and they say, "Oh, you're good for nothing." You go right back to the old identity, and if you do that a few times, you may not want the insecurity. It's like, I don't want to trust that identity because it's not stable. Right? The ego values certainty, protection from the unknown, more than anything else. Right? The ego does not value pleasure more than anything else. It values certainty and the protection of the unknown. So, there's different points in our life when our identity, our pattern, the one that we're trying to cultivate, is hanging by a thread. Because, as the ego will abandon it if there isn't enough support, if the ego cannot believe that this identity can be held, because the ego wants certainty, right? And it's a very tragic thing to be in the midst of, to want something desperately, to know that it might be possible, and then to give up what we want the most and pick something more stable, right? Maybe we want to, be a painter or be a poet, or we want to pursue a particular relationship, and we want it more than we want anything else. And yet we watch ourselves as we look at the odds and say, there's only a 3% chance that I could do that. And I can't bear the disappointment. I can't bear the risk of failure. And I just don't feel enough certainty to ask them out, to go enroll in that class, to confront my parents about this. I'd like to tell them I'm gay, but if they behaved like this and did that, etc., it would be so awful. I'm not ready to deal with that, right? So I'm going to keep pretending, right, to be straight. I'm not going to ask them out. I'm not going to enroll in school. I'm going to turn away from what awakens me, because I don't have the certainty, right? This is a very fragile moment where the ego's prioritizing certainty ahead of what brings us true joy. And one of the best ways to establish certainty is to pursue normalcy, the path that everyone else has taken. It's a well-worn trail, right? And so it's incredibly common for egos to choose normalcy over happiness, right? Because happiness often takes you off of the beaten trail towards your uniqueness, towards your individuality. But what's most unique about you is not a well-worn trail. So it's less certain, right? And the more traumatized our egos are, the more they seek certainty. So other people, right, are wild cards in this balance, right? Because there's all these different entities, the different patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, both from our past and questions, who am I really, etc. There's all these different entities. And our eye is looking for a solid one, right? One we can count on, right? Particularly if there's a traumatic history. And if we open up and share the dilemma, the dialogue between this entity and this entity, right? This part is saying this. First of all, every time we open up to someone, it's done with a belief that they have some value. Right? Nobody opens up to someone on the supposition that the person has zero value. Why would you do it, right? So if you open up to someone, particularly to ask advice or get help, you have to believe that this person could give you good advice, is more likely to than not, could give you help, right? And that what they say is likely to be helpful. But what if they say, yeah, you really shouldn't be a painter. There's no money in it, etc., right? So you opened up and they strengthen the safe entity. And that's you maybe open up one more time and they encourage the same thing. And someone else isn't interested at all. And by the time you have those three encounters, it's your ego cannot believe independently of all that feedback that the painting is a good idea. Right? Sometimes identity hangs by a thread. And the question is, particularly in times when we're isolated and need help, is it good to reach out and ask for help? We need help. Right? If we want to support our positive identity, is it intelligent to reach out? Particularly going into the unknown, right? To just ask a stranger to reach out, or someone you don't know very well. And here it's good to look at statistics. Right? What are the statistical likelihoods in your cult, in your culture, that you're going to receive intelligent advice, right? Because in confusing and highly psychologically illiterate cultures, such as our own, the odds are quite low that someone is going to be empathic, attuned, take your issue seriously enough to really pay attention, ask the questions needed to understand something, and, for example, encourage you to pursue happiness over normalcy. Right? So you're looking at a statistical minority. And so in some cases, it's not safe to go outside of your own kind of search and working towards a dream, towards a goal. It's not safe, right? Because you're vulnerable, right? Your ego is swayable. When you have a fragile identity, and like a fragile dream, when you have a dream that everyone else thinks is foolish, etc., to share that dream and have everyone think it's foolish, it's a fragile identity, right? And so keeping it inside at that point and developing it, building foundation for it, building a basis for it, believing in it yourself, and taking small 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, an hour here, an hour there, day after day, right? And building towards that picture can be far more effective, even though you desperately want support and want help, right? If the statistics are very risky, right? It can be very valuable to take your own counsel and take the steps that you can to build that identity up to a point where it can withstand a rejection, right? If you're trying to build, for example, your love ability, and it's very fragile because there's so much traumatic history. There's a tendency of your ego to say, I'm never going to be loved and all this. And you ask someone and they don't respond the way that you want. And you ask another person, they don't respond to another. At some point, the ego will just have a fit, right? I'm never going to have this, right? And so it can be more valuable to build that identity, that pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being about being lovable, right? Learning to love yourself, learning to reach a point, and understanding that particularly in our culture, the dating odds are horrible, right? Dating odds are horrible, particularly because we're so influenced by people's self-image, right? And so when part of our self-image is a traumatic and abused self-image that says I'm not lovable, and then part of me is saying, no, I really should be, and I could be, and I think I am, right? We're sending out those two projections of ourselves, right? And people veer to the negative, right? If they get two projections, one that says I'm not lovable and one that says I'm lovable, right? People are afraid, right? And so they amplify the negative. So I think it's more valuable in those cases of fragility to take steps on the inside to a point that no matter what someone says, we can objectively evaluate and say, yeah, I don't need your validation, right? At that point, it's safe to reach out and take bets, right? Because every interaction is a bet at that point. Are you going to leave me in a stronger place, better able to love myself, better able to understand the possibility field and what I can do to maximize that and tilt it in a positive direction? Or are you going to leave me feeling insignificant, demoralized, less interested in becoming the person I want to become?